Yeehaw, partners! Today we're talking about the Klondike Gold Rush and Call of the Wild. In today's episode of Badly Lit Book Reviews, I really liked this book when I was a kid. It's a really good sort of teenager adventure novel. It's got a couple of issues which I hadn't really noticed until recently. The first is that it's very American. No, there's nothing wrong with an American novel being very American, but this novel's set in Canada. One of the main books about the Klondike Gold Rush, or books set in the Klondike Gold Rush, is extremely American. Just bugs me a little bit. The second issue links into that, kind of, and it has to do with the ending. The ending it kind of sucks a little bit, but it's also ahistorical. It's kind of wrong. So sort of a brief summary of the book. It's about a pet dog in sort of California who gets kidnapped for use as a sled dog in the Yukon. He sort of bounces between owners and he learns some rough lessons all along the way until he goes from a domesticated city dog to a proper rough and tumble backcountry Yukon dog. He goes from various owners. Some of them are good and some of them are bad, and a lot of them are in between. He eventually, towards the end, he winds up with a good owner. So they're out prospecting, his good owner and a little team of other prospectors. One day while they're working, our protagonist has got nothing to do, so he decides to go AWOL. He runs off into the woods and he has some adventures. And when he returns to the camp, he finds that his good owner and all the other prospectors have been slaughtered by Indians. And this is wrong. This didn't happen. Of course it didn't happen. It's fiction. What do you expect? What, you want everything to be real? This isn't the sort of environment where this sort of stuff happened. There weren't Indian raids during the Klondike Gold Rush. That's an American thing. So Jack London is taking sort of an American stereotype about the Old West and injecting it into the Klondike where it doesn't belong, into the Canadian Old West. And why is he doing that? Well, it's kind of a convention of adventure novels at the time. This is an Old West kind of story, and Old West kind of stories have Indian raids. He's just injecting it because it fits the formula. That's what I really want to talk about here, because I think it's kind of interesting. So in the American Old West, there were these sort of incidents of just sort of random violence between indigenous people and settlers. That sort of stuff didn't happen in Canada. Now, Canada wasn't some sort of perfect, peaceful utopia. There was violence every now and again, but the violence was very small scale and very targeted. You didn't get just a band of Indians coming and just pillaging some random farmstead. Apart from the Iroquois French Wars in the 16 and 1700s, that sort of stuff didn't really happen. So in the pre-Confederation days, the Canadian West, it was all owned by the Hudson Bay Company. It was all Rupert's land, which meant that almost all of the white folks in Western Canada were Hudson Bay Company employees. Now, the Hudson Bay Company, they got up to some nefarious stuff from time to time. However, the Hudson Bay Company was a sort of stabilizing force relative to just random people coming in and doing trading. Hudson Bay Company has hiring policies, it has sort of standards of conduct, which limit the behavior people are going to get up to. The Hudson Bay Company also it's a corporate entity with ties to the Crown, which makes it kind of risk averse. I remember reading about one episode, I think it was in British Columbia, where Hudson Bay Company post was set up, and the head of this post, he went and kidnapped a native girl for nefarious purpose. So the native girl's family, they came in, they gunned him down, they gunned down the 4 other Hudson Bay Company employees. Now, this was just a group of prospectors with no sort of government oversight, no higher entity looking over them. The other prospectors might think, hey, they can't be doing that, even if it was warranted. Let's go and burn down the native village. And then you got a war on your hands. But because this was a Hudson Bay Company post, the company gets to make the decision about whether there's going to be retaliation. Hey, you know what? Yeah, revenge would be sweet, but fighting a war isn't all that profitable, and profit is more important. So we're just going to move the trading post a couple 100 miles south. They don't get to direct trade with us anymore. Right? You're going to take justice into your own hands. We're not going to trade with you. Easy as pie. Now, post-Confederation, when Canada came on the scene and they started opening up the West to colonists, Canada sort of had the American model to learn from. okay, these Americans are just going in and starting Indian wars everywhere, and this costs a lot of lives and a lot of money, and it's just inconvenient. I think the inciting incident was that a group of Americans came up and tried to import American-style Indian policy. So a group of Americans came up and they started building, I think, whiskey forts to trade liquor to native folks. The people from one of these forts, they came and they saw a group of, I think, Crees, and they just gunned them all down. And Canada's like, oh God, these Americans are going to start a war. We need to stop this. So they established the Northwest Mounted Police. From then on, there was very little violence. Now the Mounties, they got kind of a complicated reputation. The stereotypes of them as sort of Dudley Do-Right, these just upstanding, incorruptible pillars of virtue, they're exaggerations, but there's one part of the Mountie reputation that I think is justified, is this reputation for cold, ruthless, brutal, indiscriminate justice. Just like, okay, you guys are fighting, we're going to bust everybody's heads and throw them all in jail. See how you like that? I don't care who started it, you're all going to jail. So when you have these little incidents, some prospector gets handsy with the native girls and some native guy goes and takes revenge, Mounties would come in kind of promptly, bust everybody's heads, throw them all in jail. So the cycles of violence in Canada, they didn't sort of spiral and spiral and spiral to the American point where you've got just random violence out in the wilderness. In Canada, the cycles of violence, they never got to make more than one rotation. Now, going back to the book here, this is set during the Klondike Gold Rush. Now, the Klondike Gold Rush was not like gold rushes down in the United States. It was not a Wild West sort of situation. The Mounties got established in the Yukon really quickly after the start of the gold rush. And because it was such a remote region, there were only a couple of good ways into the Yukon Valley. So the Mounties could set up these sort of checkpoints in and out of the valley and check everybody who's coming in. There was very little murder going on during the Klondike Gold Rush. So during the Klondike Gold Rush, there weren't just bands of roving Indians cutting about and murdering all of these poor defenseless prospectors. That sort of stuff wasn't going on.
Part of why this is a problem is that someone reading Jack London might come away with the perspective that this was just an everyday occurrence. Most people aren't reading history books, they get their history from fiction. The Call of the Wild might very well be your average person's only exposure with the Klondike Gold Rush.
I looked it up. I did some research. I tried to find any instances whatsoever equivalent to what happens in this book. There were two incidents that I found which are sort of pertinent. There's a rich merchant who gets robbed by a group of white bandits on his way through the mountains. So he and two of his porters are killed. This was all over the newspapers. This was the most exciting, the most dangerous and violent and horrible incident in the whole of the Klondike Gold Rush. A rich merchant and two of his guys killed by some white bandits. The single worst instance of violence during the Klondike Gold Rush was 3 people. So right away, the event in this book is on par with the worst thing during the Klondike Gold Rush. I was able to find exactly one instance during the whole of the Klondike Gold Rush of indigenous people killing a prospector. So 4 indigenous people murdered a prospector. These 4 indigenous people were the Nantuck brothers. I've got a picture of them inserted here. They ranged from 14 at the youngest to 22 at the oldest. Apparently they were friendly with the guy they murdered. They'd been borrowing tools from him for a couple of weeks, and then one day they just come and shoot him. This prospector's killed instantly. One of his friends is just wounded, manages to escape through the wilderness, makes it back to Dawson. The Mounties come up, they round up these 4 brothers, and they bring them in to try them. They don't speak English, so we don't really have their side of the story. We know that they confessed to the murder. There was debate at the time about whether or not they should all be hanged, because 2 of them were quite young, like 14 and 16. So the argument was, well, they were probably just influenced by their older brothers. These 2 shouldn't be hanged. It should just be the older 2 who should be hanged. It was a moot point because the younger 2 died in prison while awaiting sentencing. The older 2 were promptly hanged. People speaking to the local indigenous community after the fact, the indigenous people believed that it was a revenge killing. The story goes that an old woman had got her hands on a bottle of arsenic powder and had somehow got it into her head that it was baking soda. One interpretation is that she just assumed it was baking soda. Another one is that some prospector was pranking her and said, yeah, this stuff is baking soda. You should put it in your bread. You should definitely put it in your bread. And so several people had been poisoned with arsenic and died. The community had come in and tried to seek redress, and the prospectors were not willing to address it. We don't know how you got that. We don't know who gave it to you. What do you want us to do? So this group of 4 teenage hotheads decided, well, we're going to go and get some indiscriminate revenge. This is the only instance I could find of indigenous people killing a white fella during the Yukon gold rush. Even this doesn't really fit what's presented in Call of the Wild, because if this had happened, it would be the most famous episode in the whole of the Klondike gold rush, because you got 3 people killed on par with the worst thing that ever happened there, and it's being done by Indians. It's an Indian massacre, and it's the worst instance of violence in the whole thing. It just kind of bugs me what he's presented here.
I feel like historical fiction is supposed to fit into the gaps of history. These are events that weren't important enough for the history books to record, sort of thing. It bugs me when they make up events that would have been significant if they had been real.
So Jack London has inserted into his work of historical Canadian fiction this episode of American Western tradition. Why has he done this? Well, he's done it for 2 reasons. One, he needs to have the good prospector killed. The good prospector has to die in order for the dog's cycle of rewilding to be completed. Now, he could have him die in perfectly historically accurate fashion. The shaft caved in and my owner was crushed. What a tragedy. He could have that, but that's not exciting. He's writing an adventure novel, and he's an American. And in all the American adventure novels, there's Indian raids. How can he write a book for teenagers if there isn't an Indian raid? We need an Indian raid. It wouldn't be Wild West fiction without an Indian raid. And it's a perfectly convenient scapegoat. Everybody knows that this stuff was happening all the time. You couldn't go 10 miles without people getting gunned down by Indians. Filled full of arrows. That's another thing. This is the 1890s. People have guns. This is just so commonplace that I can just slip it in and nobody's going to notice it. It's a perfectly valid reason why the owner might get killed. Except it isn't. This is Canada. There's a concept called Orientalism. This was coined by a fellow called Edward Said, who was I think a Palestinian intellectual. He talks about how the West's image of the East doesn't really have anything to do with the East itself. So if you look at like a movie like Aladdin, it's not a depiction of really anywhere. It's a weird little hodgepodge of the Middle East and of like India. It doesn't really have anything to do with, let's say, Baghdad. It's not even a caricature. It doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just a self-perpetuating meme. I really think that we need an equivalent to Orientalism for talking about indigenous people. Indianism. Pan-Indianism, whatever. Jack London is doing an Indianism. All Indians everywhere are the same. You've seen one Indian, you've seen them all.
All Indians live in teepees, subsist solely off of buffalo meat, which they hunt from horseback using bows and arrows, and they paint themselves red when they dance around the totem pole. Their standard hobbies include drinking, poverty, pillaging, and eating babies in caves.
The American experience is perfectly valid to transpose into the Canadian Yukon. He's generating this image, this stereotype that goes beyond a stereotype. It doesn't have anything to do with the real. It's hyper-real. It's better than real. More real than real. Jack London and his hyper-real Indians. Holy heck. So, Jack London's Call of the Wild. It's a good book, way too American, and it's racist in a really interesting way. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope I can cobble this together into something halfway usable. All the best. Ta-ta.